Thank you for listening to the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast with hosts Clara and Jimmy Hinton. If you're new to the podcast, please look us up on your favorite podcast app, subscribe, like, and share so that you never miss an episode. If you'd like to further support us, visit patreon.com/speakingout and check out the different rewards. You'll find exclusive rewards if you sign up as a patron of the podcast. Thank you for your support, and let's get into the show. Welcome to this week's podcast. Thank you, as always, to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Those numbers keep going up, and 70 is the magic number. Right now, we have 70 patrons, and I was just looking at something about Patreon and how it works, and there are like all these different algorithms and calculations for figuring out how many patrons you should have. If you have 100,000 followers, you should have X amount of patrons. And we actually far surpass what is average for the number of listeners that we have for this podcast. Right. We far surpass the average, which is incredible. Yes. And we want that to keep growing. The reason we want that to grow, a couple of reasons. One is that it truly does support this podcast. It has paid for the studio that we're sitting in. It has paid for our equipment, which is not cheap. No. The camera especially. But that's what keeps this podcast going. But the other reason is that when we reach 150, so we're at 70 now, when we reach 150 patrons, we are hosting a retreat for all of our patrons, an in-person retreat.
About that, I know.
So
let's do it,
and that's regardless of any level. So if you want 100 people to sign up at the $5 tier, which is the lowest tier we have, then it's okay. We'll still. It doesn't matter. So it doesn't matter what tier. So look at the tiers. Go to patreon.com/speakingout. Look at the different tiers. See if there's something that you would be interested in. Because we don't want people to just give money. We want people to get rewards for your precious dollars, because honestly, it's hard work. So I support people on Patreon.
As do I.
And it's one of those things. We don't ask people to do something that we don't do ourselves.
Right.
So go to patreon.com/speakingout and just check it out. Just do that. It's in the description of the podcast. You can just go down to the description, click on it, and just check it out. Just go that far.
Keep thinking retreat.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes.
Okay, today's podcast. Man, I was just asked by a former preacher who I respect and I admire. He said, "Hey, just a quick question." He said, "We have this registered sex offender who is persistently trying to come to church." And he said, I'm a hard no. He said, "I'm just going to say that up front. Like, for me, it is an absolute no. Not going to happen." He said, "But the elders are really divided." And he said half of them think that in the name of grace, we should let them in. And half of us are like, yeah, no. This person just got out of prison. He was in for sex crimes against kids. Not going to happen. So he said, "What's your opinion?" And he's, in all fairness, he's not listened to the podcast and he's not read a lot of my stuff, which I talk about obsessively. And I said, look, the longer I do this, the harder my stance is that it is a concrete, emphatic shout from the rooftop, no, absolutely not. If the registered sex offender, and again, there are different kinds of offenses, all under that umbrella, but if it has to do with any kind of violence, a violent sex act or a sex act of any kind against any minor, it's a hard no.
Exactly.
Period.
Yeah, exactly.
Regardless of the tier, regardless of what recidivism rates are supposedly for that offense. It doesn't matter. It's a hard no. And this was this was just a couple days ago. And today I come across this article. And this article is from November 28th. It says, title of the article, New York Post, registered sex offender charged with raping two women at New York City hotel. Of course, it caught my attention. And I start reading. And here it turns out this dirtbag, which, if you're offended that I'm calling him that, I have other words for him, but they're probably not fit for the public airwaves. We'd get blocked. This dirtbag, registered sex offender, does 3.5 years in state prison, which he's in the state of New York, so big shock. They have extremely light sentences for these horrific crimes. And a lot of states are following suit for a whole host of reasons. A lot of that is overpopulation in the prison.
Right.
These prisons are just splitting at the seams. My goodness. There's an overpopulation problem. So I'd say that's probably at the root of the problem for these light sentences. But the other is, sometimes you get bleeding heart politicians who are like, oh, well, we need to give people a second chance. Pennsylvania is one of those states that we have bleeding heart politicians that they just think that prison is too harsh for these people. And so they're releasing them like crazy. Anyway, registered sex offender who did 3 years in state prison for sexually assaulting a 15-year-old girl is now charged with raping two different women at a Bronx hotel. Dashawn Williams, who was released on parole 2 years ago, was back behind bars. Now listen to this. Back behind bars on $100,000 bail. That's it?
It just
$100,000,
I
which
read,
you only have to raise 10% of that.
I know. I read that article.
He'll be back out on the
over
streets.
and
I guarantee
over
it.
again. And his crimes were not little softies, by the way.
No.
He was very forceful. And these rapes were horrific.
Yeah, and we can't say it. We'll get blocked for it.
Right.
But
And
yeah,
I know
it gives a lot of description
I'm not
in the
going
news
to-
article, and I'll link to that in
Right.
the description.
Was horrific. The thing that sticks out in my mind when going back to the retired preacher that you talked to about this sex offender wanting to go to church there was the word persistent. He was persistent. He's persistent. He doesn't want to take no for an answer. This is a prime example of what happens when that persistence is it's caved into and you allow a person.
Yes.
Am I being harsh in saying that? No. The statistics speak for themselves. This guy, and I know, when he gets out of jail, he's going to be right back in again. You already know it.
Absolutely. And he'll get out. He will get out.
And
Most likely somebody's going to raise $10,000 to get him bailed out.
And he's going to repeat the crime, only this time worse. And he'll do it worse and worse. And the penalty is just not there anymore, like you said. The penalties are not there. They're getting
And he knows it.
softer and softer.
Dashawn Williams knows it.
Knows it, absolutely. So I guess my question begs, why would we invite that into? I still don't.
It blows my
understand.
mind.
Right.
It blows my mind that churches are even having these conversations. Like,
Right.
well, should we? And they have meetings about this. Like they're actually spending time wringing their hands over
What to
whether they should accept this person into the church. And I'm like, if they put, and I'm not picking on any particular church. I'm saying this is like
Excuse me.
a majority of churches. Granny's still getting over bronchitis and the flu.
Bronchitis and flu are not a good mix here. It was a nasty week. So sorry about that.
So, the fact that they're even having these conversations behind closed doors, by the way, and this is the point that I want to make and that we want to make for this podcast, is that it is up to you
Right.
and me to keep ourselves and our children and grandchildren and other people's children safe. Do not ever think that church leaders or school leaders or politicians or anybody else has the safety of your children at the forefront of their mind. They may say they do. They may think they do. They may have the heart to protect your kid. But if they're having these conversations, if they're having the debate over whether to invite a registered sex offender into the church or not, if they're even having that conversation, I can guarantee you the best interest of your children is not at the forefront of their heart. It's not.
Soft society. The word no there's a fear in using it. We see it across the board. It's accept everyone for who they are, no matter what they believe, no matter what their actions are, no matter what. Accept everybody. Don't offend anybody. Don't say a word that might possibly hurt somebody's feelings. And I'm thinking, are people for real here?
Yeah. Well, you know, just as you were talking, right up over the hill, like half a mile from here, up on Felger Road, there's this big sign. It's a new church. They bought this old, that old church building.
Okay.
Come as you are ministries. Yeah. That's the name of their church. And I'm like, this automatically is a prime target. We have 2 state prisons in Somerset, right here.
Right.
2 state prisons that outnumber our entire town's population. And these people are being released constantly. And I'm telling you, I know people who run these prisons. I know people who work at these prisons. And I'm a minister in this town where we have these prisons. These guys are being dumped out onto the street every single day. We both have worked with a program to kind of help people who are getting back out onto the streets, being released from. I forget what the program's called, the release program.
Right.
But we've done trainings at the prisons, talking to inmates to help them prepare them whenever the doors open and they just are dumped out in the streets. We were helping prepare them. I'm telling you, it's a fact that when these prison doors open up, these prisoners, regardless of where they're from, we have prisoners in these prisons who are from all over the state of Pennsylvania.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
They're state detention centers.
Which
means they're shuffled from all over, anywhere in the state of Pennsylvania.
Lots of hardcore.
They're not local people.
No.
And they're being dumped out when their sentence is up, like Dashawn Williams. When their sentence is up, those doors open up to the prison. They say, good luck.
Now, before people get all riled up and say, oh my, Jimmy and his mom hate prisoners. They have no compassion. They don't believe that anyone who's in prison can ever repent, and that's not what we're saying. We're talking about sex crimes. We're talking about
and violent sex crimes against children and against innocent women,
against children. When these people are persistent about getting into the insides of a church where there are innocent children and innocent adults. Let's face it, and we know what happens. I mean, the facts are there.
Yeah, I mean, this isn't rocket science.
Yeah, right.
It's not like we should be surprised and be like, oh my goodness, what happened? That he just fell off the wagon or whatever. He was out of prison for 2 years without, presumably, who knows, but without incident, at least without getting caught. But for 2 years, and let me tell you how this argument works. Dashawn Williams lands on the doorsteps of a church, and I'm not saying he ever did. I'm using this as a hypothetical, but hypothetically, this is what they do. Somebody who's going to prey on a church, they land on the doorsteps of a church, and they're like, come on, man. Like, I did my time. I've been out of prison for 2 years, man. I've been out of prison for 2 years, and clearly I'm not in trouble. You can talk to my parole officer.
Yeah.
He'll tell you, or she'll tell you, that I've not done a single thing, and I'll guarantee you it's true. I'll guarantee you that most of the time, these officers, these probation and parole officers, oh, Granny's having a fit over here. She's getting all wound up.
I am sorry. I just apologize. Bronchitis stinks. There you go. Okay.
It sounds like I'm rambling and doing all the talking. I'm trying to not
he's helping
let
me
her
because
talk. Every
I
time she
can't.
talks,
Yes,
we were talking before we recorded, and every time she talks, she
I
starts
get coughing.
hacking.
Yeah.
But this is how it works. These guys will say, you can call my probation officer, you can call my parole officer. And churches will start feeling guilty, and they're like, well, we did. Like, we called the officer, and they said this, Dashawn Williams hasn't caused any problems. He's, we don't see any problem. We can't stop him from going to church, which oftentimes is true. Probation and parole officers don't really have that power. And so they land on the doorsteps. They say, look, I've been out for 2 years, and I can't find a church anywhere that'll accept me, which is not true, but they're going to use that. They're going to lie about it. And they're going to say, I'm not a troublemaker. I did my time. I learned my lesson. Right. It's the whole song and dance. So this guy for 2 years was out on parole. And guess what? 2 different innocent women he violently rapes. One at knife point, the other one
with a hammer.
With a hammer. And then this is the sentence that got me, the very last sentence of this article. My jaw about dropped when I read the last sentence of this article. Written November 28th of 2022. Yesterday.
Yes, yesterday. Yes.
Right? Today's the 29th.
Yesterday.
We're recording on the 20th. Yeah,
Yes.
we're recording on so this is yesterday. This is right now. This kind of garbage is going on all the time. Listen to this last sentence. In addition to that case, talking about the 15-year-old girl that he spent a measly 3.5 years in prison. In addition to that case, Williams has been arrested several times in the past, including for aggravated harassment and, wait till you hear this, folks, and criminal obstruction of breathing, according to law enforcement sources. Now, if you guys are wondering, well, how would you know all this stuff? Somebody lands on the doorsteps and they maybe they admit, maybe they don't, that they're a sex offender, they're a registered sex offender. How are you going to know this kind of stuff? Do your homework. We just did a training. We did a live Zoom demonstration where we showed 4 different ways to look up backgrounds, including criminal checks, looking up sex offender registry, looking at social media, digging the internet for news articles, and looking at court dockets. Those 4 different methods, that training is not being released to the public because we promised our patrons that they're paying for benefits,
Right.
rewards, and that's one of the rewards that we do. Is it's a monthly training. If you want access to that, it is absolutely golden. This guy should have been caught by other people. Now, the general public, it's a little bit harder because, especially in a big city, he just kind of flies under the radar. It's super easy.
Right.
But at churches, we don't have an excuse. We don't have an excuse. We've got to look up people who come into the door. I don't care who they are. We should start digging a little bit
the way,
and
we
find
can't
out
go by
who these
looks.
people are.
We're
Not at
probably
all.
thinking that, is this unkempt or gross looking person or whatever. Don't go by that.
No.
It could be the most innocent looking man or woman who has committed the
Absolutely.
most horrific of crimes against children.
Absolutely.
We really do need to get serious about doing our homework.
Absolutely. And here are a couple points we want to make. One, this shouldn't shock us.
Yeah.
This makes sense to me. I read this article and I was like, the only thing that's shocking to me is that he gets such a light sentence, but even that makes sense. He's in New York. New York is notorious for giving light sentences. They have a horrific overpopulation in their prisons. New York, California, Pennsylvania, those probably are three of some of the worst states
top 3, yeah,
for just turning inmates out because there's such an overpopulation problem. And I'm not placing blame. It's, it is what it is, but that's reality. Very rarely does somebody ever get a conviction in the first place. But when they do get a conviction, don't count on these people spending a lot of time behind bars. When they get out, don't count on your church leaders. If you're at a church, we talk about churches most often. If you're at a church, don't make an assumption that just because you're going to church, you don't have church leaders behind closed doors deliberating about whether to have a sex offender in the church or not. And I'll guarantee you that the congregation, one, is not part of these conversations, and two, that the congregation has no idea that there's a sex offender persistently asking to be a part of that church. And three, if that sex offender is allowed into the church, which most often leaders do allow it.
Right.
Most often, I would argue 90+% of the time, church leaders will welcome them in, whether they get worn down by obsessive persistentness, or typically it's because of their false, horrific views on what grace is. But they do not tell you, the church member, you, the lay church member, they do not tell you when there's a registered sex offender in the church. Almost never is the church informed.
This should be making us, as we're listening, get crazy. This should make us just get crazy.
It should make us ask questions.
With just wanting to do more to keep our kids safe.
Yeah.
It really should. Is the picture of child abuse getting smaller? No. Is child trafficking getting smaller? No. Are children still getting hurt in the sense that abuse is taking place? Yes. Has that expanded? Yes. It's gotten
more
bigger.
and more and more all the time, every day.
Right.
It's
So
gotten
not
and it's getting
working.
worse. That's right.
Something's not working. And I know there are still people on the sidelines who are going to say, well, where's remediation for these people? How do we help
Not
them?
our job.
And that's where
not
the
our job.
church, I think, gets so weak in their decision, because they're thinking, well, we're like a hospital. We're supposed to help.
Yeah, we're a
help
hospital.
this
I was a part of a congregation where the preacher who was he was a professor of mine too. He would start every sermon by saying, "We are not a showcase for saints. We're a hospital for sinners."
I've heard that so many times. Right.
And what that means is, that's just another kind of sly way of saying everybody's welcome
Everybody
here,
is
regardless of what your past is.
Now we have to go back again, Jimmy. Again, I'll repeat it again and again. Go to that those sessions we taught on the fruits of the Spirit.
Yeah.
One of the best tools we can ever have. And just use your brain, use common sense. Are there other places where a person can worship? Do they have to be in a place where there are young children? No.
Right?
No. They do not.
That's exactly right.
They do not. So you're not saying you can't worship. We're just saying, no, not here, where temptation
that's
would
right.
be all these young children. That's all that's being said. And I think
That's right.
when we reframe that, that'll become easier to say no. But until we do that, it's going to be the same old.
Well, and I've heard all this nonsense that, they need community, and it's because they don't have community. These sex offenders, because they felt abandoned and they didn't have community, and they felt alone and they felt sad and depressed and aggravated and all this stuff because of the lack of community. That's why they lashed out and offended these children. And I was like, no. First of all, we've talked about this on the show before. How many of us feel lonely and alienated and depressed and sorrowful and self-loathing and all that stuff? All of us have at some point.
Everybody.
We don't go out and rape children.
No.
Like that's not our response. Like, oh my goodness, I'm so lonely. I know what I'm gonna do. Like, who thinks that way? And so to use that as an excuse and say, well, as part of their rehabilitation, as part of their coming to Christ, we need to provide them community. No, we don't.
No, we do
No, we don't.
not.
No, we don't. First of all, no, we don't. Second of all, if it's community that they seek, I read a recent study post-COVID. I think it's something like over 60% of all churches now live stream
I was going to say,
or have the
there's-
capability
right,
to do it. If they're not
right,
actively doing it, they have the ability to do it.
right.
That's a lot of churches. If it's community that you want, and by the way, our live stream, nothing spectacular. It's not not a lot of bells and whistles, but the people who are there on live stream, guess what they do? They have community.
They
They
do.
interact.
They
They
do.
type all throughout.
Absolutely.
With the people who
Absolutely.
run our
Yes.
live stream,
Right.
they take prayer
I'm
requests.
so glad you said that.
It's
because
very
there
interactive.
that is community on
Absolutely,
a
it is.
level where no child will get hurt.
That's right.
So
That's right.
I just wish our church leaders would begin thinking that way.
Yeah.
I truly do.
Well, we need to make them think that way. When that's the response, well, we need to provide them community. First of all, no, we don't. Secondly, okay, great. If you're committed to that idea that they need community, let's give it to them online. Let them watch from the comfort of their home. Not here where you have a smorgasbord of children running around.
No.
Not going to happen. That ain't going to happen at our church. And people need to start taking that stance and just say, no, that's no. Dashawn Williams,
You would
nope.
not.
You're
you
not-
would
you're not welcome
take
here.
A murderer, and that murderer gets released from prison. You would not arm that murderer with a gun.
Right.
Why would you do that? You wouldn't.
Hey,
So
we're trusting
why-
that we'll put controls on you and we're going to have two people sit on either side of
Right,
you and make sure
watch
you don't pull the
and keep
trigger.
you right.
You
Why
what now?
would we take someone who is a child destroyer,
Mm-hmm.
I'll call that, an abuser, and arm them with pews of children?
But we're going to
young
sit beside
children.
you and make sure you don't touch
Right.
one of them.
It just
It
makes,
doesn't work.
No,
It does
doesn't
not work.
It makes
It
zero
never has.
sense.
It never will.
Right.
I don't care how you try to nuance this or twist it. It will never work.
No.
Putting two adults on either side of a registered sex offender and saying, well, we're going to keep this quiet from the rest of the church, and we're going to assign
keep
two
an eye
leaders
on
to
this. Yeah.
to keep watch on you. And I know we're not going to let you into the children's wing, the most organized and structured part of the church, where we have accountability, high levels of accountability. We're not going to let you back there, but where kids run free and where they roam, you're welcome to come into that space. It's insanity. This is stupidity.
It is. It is.
There's no other way to look at
We
it.
need to wake up. We need to learn to stand on what we know is the truth. We need to make
Yeah.
hard decisions in order to protect our children.
Yeah.
Plain and simple.
So, you've heard us say this before on this podcast. I'm going to say it again and again and again and again. Often ask your church leaders this question: are there any registered sex offenders attending this church right now? Ask it that point blank, and don't let them give you a, humming around, like talking in circles. Yes or no? Are there any registered sex offenders attending this church right now? And if the answer is yes, your second question is, who?
Mm-hmm.
And they better give you an answer, and you better press them for an answer.
Mm-hmm.
And none of this, well, they did their time, and we don't feel it's right to call their sins out and to shame them publicly. It's a public registry.
Right.
A sex
Yeah.
offender registry.
Right. And I think
is
people
public
forget
for a
that,
reason.
too. It's public for a reason, to help protect people.
Yeah.
That's why.
And the third
Yes.
question is, okay, well, what are you doing with this person?
Mm-hmm.
Why are they here? What controls do you have in place? Clearly, you didn't think it was important enough to inform all of us parents who have little kids here that there's a ticking time bomb, a Dashawn Williams sitting in the pews. Clearly, you didn't think they were valuable enough, or we were valuable enough as parents to tell us. So what measures are you taking? And then Another fun question is, have you contacted the church's insurance company to let them know
Yeah.
that you have a sex offender attending here? And if they haven't, please, I beg you, and don't bluff about this. Take it upon yourselves and tell your leadership that you're taking it upon yourselves to contact the insurance company on behalf of the church leaders who failed to do so. You want to watch people squirm? They won't squirm about the children. They'll be like, oh, but God's grace. And they won't squirm. I promise you this. They won't squirm in their seats when you talk about the protection of children.
No,
but when you talk about liability and say, wait a second, have you contacted the insurance company? Have you told our insurance agent that you have this high-risk ticking time bomb sitting in the pews? Have you informed them about that? You're going to watch them get uncomfortable. And it's a shame that that's what it takes, but I'll use anything that I can
I was
can
gonna
get
say,
to get it
it's
through their
time.
thick skulls
It's
that this
time
isn't
to
a good idea.
quit playing games with our kids.
That's right.
That's all.
It doesn't make sense.
No,
It doesn't make sense to me. Why, and again, you can disagree with me all day long, and that's fine. I'm not here to twist people's arms and I'm not here to convince anybody that sex offenders don't belong at church. If you want to welcome them with open arms.
That's not what's being said, though.
That's
They
fine,
just
but
should not be
people should be
in
informed.
the midst with children. Number one,
Right.
There are adult
know.
worship services.
I know.
Let's face it, there are, or the online. There are other ways of worshiping
I know.
God. Nobody's preventing anybody from worshiping God.
No.
So that's
But
not.
yeah, I mean, people at a bare minimum, people should be informed, and
Absolutely,
churches should be
positively.
honest about this, and they should not try to hide things
Right.
and hide facts and hide people who are they have a history, they have a criminal
dangers,
record.
That's all. Known dangers.
They've done it.
to children.
They didn't think about
Yes,
it. They
right,
followed through and
right,
actually did it.
Right.
They don't belong there. They just don't belong there. So if they are there, if that's your church's stance, if that's your weird theology or whatever, then more power to you. But at a bare minimum,
Well, then
people should be
parents
informed. Parents should be
then
informed.
have the opportunity to make the decision.
That's right.
Do I continue here and allow my children to be at risk?
That's right.
Or do I find a
And
safe
parents
place?
should
Yes.
have that option.
Yes.
If the church is allowing
Yes.
them to be there,
That
parents
should be
they
right.
should be informed, and they
Right.
should have
Yes.
that
Option
freedom.
to make that
and
decision.
that's right.
Right.
That's exactly right. Well, man, I wish
you
we
were
would just.
fired up,
I wish
I'm
we would just say.
telling you, James.
I wish we would say what we believe.
Yeah, I know. Yeah.
You guys know where we stand. I know we've been drumming this beat for years now, but I get so fired up when I read these articles, and
Because we know what the end result
I
is.
know.
You've
I
been
know.
contacted
I
by
know.
so many churches.
then they're
where
surprised when they
offenses have taken place then.
and they're surprised.
Abuse
They're like, we
has
don't know
taken
what happened.
place,
I do.
And children have been harmed
Yeah.
when it could have been prevented.
I know. It's
So,
all. I
yeah.
mean, not all preventable, but this kind is
parts
preventable.
of it is, yes.
So anyway, thank you guys for tuning into this episode. I'm gonna go stick my head in a bucket of ice to cool down a little bit, and we will catch you next round. Thanks.
Thanks again for listening to today's episode. A special thank you to our patrons who make this podcast possible. Please help us get the word out by searching for the Speaking Out on Sex Abuse podcast in your favorite podcast app. Be sure to hit subscribe and rate the show. Please consider supporting the podcast by becoming a patron and check out the rewards our patrons receive.